Welcome back to the Deep Dive.
Good to be here.
So today we've got a story lined up that is, well, it's quite something. Drawn from the history of science.
It really is. It involves a really radical idea about human origins, where we actually came from.
And not just the idea, but this persistent claim, that the scientific establishment actively, deliberately buried it.
Exactly. We've got a stack of sources looking into this whole thing.
We're talking about Florentino Ameghino,
Yeah.
an ancient ancestor he proposed called Tetraprothomo. And what some people genuinely describe as a major scientific cover-up.
Yeah. So our mission today in this deep dive is to sort of cut through all that.
Right. Unpack the sources, figure out what Ameghino actually claimed, understand the science, how it was presented, and how it was challenged.
And then trace how this suppression theory actually came about. Why does it still stick around? Why does it fascinate people?
It's about getting the key info quickly, pulling out the surprising bits, and seeing how, the same history could be viewed in such wildly different ways.
Totally different lenses.
Okay, so let's get into it. Where does this story even begin? Because it's not the usual places like Africa or Europe, is it?
Not at all. We need to go to South America, Argentina specifically, late 19th, early 20th century.
Okay.
And the central figure is Florentino Ameghino, lived 1854 to 1911, roughly.
And who was he? What was his background?
Well, he was largely self-taught, which is incredible. A real powerhouse naturalist, paleontologist, anthropologist, zoologist, the works.
Wow.
And completely dedicated to studying the fossil beds in Argentina, the Pampas, which are incredibly rich, by the way.
And he wasn't just digging up fossils, right? He had a whole interpretation.
Oh, yeah. A very specific interpretation. And one that just completely clashed with what most scientists thought at the time.
How so? What was the big idea?
It was absolutely revolutionary for its day. The scientific world was focused on the Old World, Europe, Asia, maybe starting to look at Africa for human origins. Ameghino just points straight at South America. He says, no, this is where it all began, the Pampas, the cradle of humanity.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
That's a bold claim. Did he just say humans started there, or was there more to it?
Oh, much more. He wasn't vague. He laid out a whole evolutionary timeline, a sequence, and the really wild part, he pushed the dates back way further than anyone was really considering for human ancestors back then. Millions of years.
Millions. Into what kind of time frame?
Deep time. Pliocene, even the Miocene epoch. We're talking, potentially 5, 10, maybe more million years ago.
That's incredibly ancient for hominin evolution, especially based on thinking from that era. So what did this lineage look like in his view?
He saw it as a kind of linear progression, a ladder almost.
Right.
Starting way back, like 4 steps removed from modern humans, was this genus he called Tetraprothomo.
Tetraprothomo, got it.
Then moving closer, you had Diprothomo platensis, 2 steps back.
Okay.
And then the immediate ancestor, just 1 step back, was Prothomo pampeus. Sometimes he called it Homo pampeus.
And his idea was these forms originated in South America.
Yes, and then migrated out from there.
So completely reversing the flow people assumed.
Exactly. South America wasn't a destination, it was the source.
Okay, you can't make claims like that without some evidence. What was he actually finding in the ground? What did he base this on?
Well, he pointed to a few different things from those Pampean deposits. The most crucial evidence, really, for building that lineage were bone fragments.
Right, the fossils themselves, like the ones for Tetraprothomo. What were they specifically?
Yeah, Tetraprothomo is the key one for the deepest part of his theory, and it was based mainly on just 2 bones found at a site called Monte Hermoso.
2 bones, that's it.
Primarily, yes. An atlas vertebra, that's the very top bone in your neck, connects to the skull, and a piece of a femur, a thigh bone.
Okay, so fragments, very specific fragments. Did he have anything else? Tools, maybe?
Yes, he did. He reported finding what he believed were very crude, very simple stone tools and other artifacts.
And these were deep down, in those supposedly ancient layers.
That was the claim. Found deep in the strata, suggesting really ancient human-like activity.
And I remember reading about Terracosita, too. Baked earth.
Right, Terracosita. These were layers in the ground that looked baked or hardened, sometimes described almost like slag or scoriae.
Well, he thought.
He interpreted them as ancient hearths, fireplaces, evidence of deliberate fire use by these ancient hominins, again, in these supposedly Pliocene or Miocene levels.
So bones, tools, fire. From his perspective, it painted a pretty complete picture, didn't it? An incredibly ancient South American origin.
It did. And you have to understand, Ameghino was hugely passionate, incredibly dedicated. His work was discussed internationally. People knew about it.
Even if they were skeptical.
Oh, definitely skepticism from the start about the most extreme claims. But it was a genuine alternative vision being proposed by a serious, if somewhat isolated researcher.
A colossal figure in Argentina, the sources say.
Absolutely. But yeah, as you can imagine, making claims is big, challenging the whole narrative, pushing dates back millions of years based on fragments. It was bound to attract intense scrutiny.
Which brings us to the next big chapter, the scientific pushback. The debunking.
Exactly. This wasn't just going to sit there. The international scientific community, the establishment, felt they had to engage with this directly.
And one name comes up again and again in that response.
Ales Hrdlička, yeah. A very prominent, very respected Czech-American anthropologist. He worked for the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C.
And he took this seriously enough to go check it out himself.
He did. In 1910, Hrdlička actually led an expedition specifically to Argentina. The goal was to visit Ameghino's sites, look at the collections, examine the evidence firsthand, and evaluate the claims.
Was he alone? Or did he bring other experts?
He wasn't alone. He collaborated with others, crucially a geologist named Bailey Willis, also input from anatomists like Rudolf Martin. It was meant to be a multi-pronged assessment.
So what did they actually do? How did they test Ameghino's ideas?
Well, the first big step was looking at the geology again, the context.
The dating of the layers where the stuff was found.
Precisely. Ameghino had pegged these finds to the Pliocene or Miocene. Very old. Hrdlička and Willis, applying the geological knowledge of their time, came to a very different conclusion.
Which was?
That many of these layers Ameghino thought were ancient were actually much, much younger, mostly Holocene, that's our current epoch, or maybe late Pleistocene. So thousands of years old, perhaps tens of thousands, but definitely not millions.
Okay, that's a massive difference. That completely undermines the claim of extreme antiquity right off the bat.
It does. If the layers aren't that old, then whatever's in them can't be that old either.
So what about the bones themselves? Especially those key Tetraprothomo bones, the atlas and the femur.
Right. Hrdlička examined those very carefully, the atlas vertebra. He concluded that, yeah, maybe it looked a bit unusual, but it fell within the range of variation you see in modern humans.
Modern humans. Not some ancient precursor.
Specifically, he noted similarities to the skeletons of Native Americans from that region, so fully modern Homo sapiens.
Okay, and the femur. The other crucial piece for Tetraprothomo.
That was even more definitive. After anatomical examination, Hrdlička and others identified it not as any kind of hominin bone.
What?
But as belonging to a carnivore. Probably a species of cat, maybe a large feline like a puma or jaguar.
A cat bone. Seriously. Not a human ancestor, but a cat.
That was the anatomical verdict. Basically zero hominin significance.
Wow, okay. So the two key Tetraprothomo fossils were re-identified as modern human and a cat. What about other bones Ameghino had found for his other proposed ancestors?
Similar story for many of them. They were reassessed as being a mixture of things. More modern human bones, often identifiable as local indigenous people, some bones from non-human primates like monkeys, and various other mammals common to the area. Basically nothing that supported an ancient, unique hominin lineage.
Okay, so the geology is wrong, the key bones are misidentified.
Yeah.
What about the tools and the baked earth, the Pterococcida?
Those were reevaluated too, the Pterococcida layers. Hrdlička and Willis argued they weren't ancient human fires.
Then what were they?
Natural phenomena. Things like spontaneous combustion of peat or lignite within the sediments, which can happen naturally and bake the surrounding earth, or just simple oxidation processes creating hardened reddish layers, not artificial fires.
Okay, natural processes, not ancient campfires.
Mm-hmm.
And the tools.
Many were reinterpreted as geofax rocks that were broken or shaped by natural forces, like tumbling in a river or pressure underground, making them look a bit like crude tools.
But they weren't intentionally made.
Exactly. And others might have been actual artifacts, but much, much more recent ones, made by the known indigenous populations of the region and found in those younger layers, not the deep ancient ones Ameghino thought.
So the scientific consensus that came out of this Hrdlička expedition was pretty damning.
It was. The conclusion, broadly shared by the international community, was that Ameghino, despite his immense effort, had built his grand theory on shaky foundations.
Lack of proper stratigraphic control, misidentification of fossils.
Right. Basically, fundamental errors in interpreting both the age of the deposits and the nature of the finds themselves. Necessary rigor was missing, they argued.
And what was the ultimate result of all this? Where did it leave Ameghino's theory?
Well, by the mid-20th century, maybe even earlier, his specific evolutionary scheme, Tetraprothomo, DEBUNKED, the whole multi-million-year South American origin story, was effectively abandoned by mainstream science.
And the focus shifted elsewhere.
Increasingly, yes. The out-of-Africa theory started gaining momentum, supported by more and more fossil discoveries in Africa, like the Australopithecines, and later by archaeology and genetics. It just became the dominant, evidence-backed consensus.
Okay, so that's the standard scientific account. Bold idea, rigorous testing, found to be flawed, science moves on.
That's the textbook version, yes.
But, and this is a big but, that's not where the story ends for everyone, is it?
Not by a long shot. This is where the narrative splits dramatically. We move from scientific debate into the realm of conspiracy theory.
The Tetraprothomo suppression idea, what's the core claim here?
The core claim is basically this. The debunking wasn't just science doing its job.
It was something else.
Yes. It was, according to this theory, a deliberate, coordinated effort to suppress Ameghino's findings. The idea is that Ameghino, maybe his methods weren't perfect, sure, but he had stumbled onto something real, something important about human origins in South America.
Something potentially older or different, anomalous.
Exactly, and that the debunking, led by Hrdlicka, was essentially a hit job designed to cover that up, to discredit him and bury the evidence.
Okay, so who allegedly did this suppressing, and why? What were the supposed motives?
Well, the sources that push this theory often point fingers at what they call the Eurocentric or colonial scientific establishment, meaning the dominant scientific institutions and figures mostly based in Europe and North America at the time. People like Hrdlicka working within that system.
And their motive.
The argument is they had a vested interest in keeping the human origin story centered on the Old World. It maintained their intellectual dominance,
Their authority.
Exactly. Shifting the cradle of humanity to South America would have been a major blow to that authority. It could also complicate colonial narratives, which often relied on the idea of old world primacy and indigenous peoples being, well, less ancient or less central to the human story.
Were other groups implicated?
Some versions of the theory bring in religious institutions.
Because of the deep time aspect?
Precisely. Ameghino's millions of years flew in the face of literal creationist timelines, which still held sway in some powerful circles. So the speculation is, maybe religious groups pressured scientific bodies to shut down these challenging ideas.
And then you get the broader conspiracy angle.
Right. Sometimes it's framed as part of a bigger picture, a global elite, a shadow government, whatever, wanting to control history for various reasons.
Like hiding inconvenient truths.
Yeah, maybe hiding evidence of lost civilizations, forgotten technologies, a different human potential, things that would disrupt the established order or view of humanity.
Controlling our past to control our present and future, essentially.
That's the kind of thinking involved. Or even protecting specific archaeological sites or resources in the Old World by keeping the focus firmly planted there.
Okay, so those are the alleged players and motives. How did they supposedly do it? What methods of suppression are claimed?
A key one is reframing Hrdlicka's work. Proponents see his expedition and his critique not as objective science, but as an overtly aggressive, predetermined campaign.
Designed to destroy Ameghino's reputation.
Yes. The perceived harshness of the critique is seen as evidence of an agenda, not just scientific disagreement, coordinated discrediting. Another claim involves the evidence itself. The suggestion is that maybe some of Ameghino's best evidence, perhaps specimens that were more convincing than the ones he published, were conveniently lost.
Lost, or maybe hidden.
Or subtly mislabeled in museum archives, tucked away somewhere, recontextualized so that later researchers couldn't easily find or verify them, making the crucial proof disappear.
Purposefully obstructing future research.
Exactly. And then there's the control of information flow.
How would that work?
The theory suggests that any later research in South America that even hinted at supporting Ameghino's deeper timeline ideas would be systematically starved of funding.
Or couldn't get published.
Right. Blocked from major journals. Effectively silencing any follow-up investigation that didn't toe the mainstream line, keeping a tight lid on the narrative.
Ensuring only the out-of-Africa story got told in textbooks, museums, media.
Pretty much. Marginalizing or just ignoring the South American possibilities, painting Ameghino purely as this flawed, misguided figure.
And finally, attacking Ameghino personally.
That's often cited too. The idea is that because he was somewhat of an outsider, self-taught, not part of the Oxbridge or Ivy League set, he was an easier target.
Easier to paint as an amateur or a crank?
Exactly. Undermine the man to undermine the work without necessarily having to engage fairly with every piece of data. A targeted attack.
So the conspiracy paints this picture of a really deliberate, multifaceted effort to just erase this alternative origin story.
That's the narrative, yes.
But, okay, if they're not finding new Tetraprothomo fossils, what evidence do proponents of this suppression theory actually point to? How do they argue the cover-up happened?
It's less about new physical evidence and more about interpreting the historical record itself, looking for anomalies, looking for signs of bias.
Okay, like what? Give me some examples.
Well, as we mentioned, the perceived aggressiveness of the debunking. Herdlich's critique is often described as unusually harsh, almost personal.
Suggesting an agenda beyond just science.
That's the interpretation. They see it as aiming to silence, not just correct. The intensity feels suspicious to them.
Okay, what else?
Ameghino's status is often emphasized. The lone genius, the independent outsider fighting the establishment.
The classic underdog story.
Right. And in this narrative, his outsider status made him both a threat and an easy target for the powerful mainstream to discredit.
Okay, makes sense within that framework.
Another point raised is about South America itself. Proponents look at the continent, it's vast, right? And they argue that paleoanthropological research there has historically been much less funded and less intensive compared to Africa or Europe.
And they see that as deliberate.
Some do, yes. They interpret it not just as lack of resources, but perhaps as a subtle way to ensure that inconvenient evidence doesn't get found. Or if it is found, it's found by people in the system who can manage it carefully.
Keep potential discoveries under wraps. Interesting. Any other points?
Yeah, they also point to later actual scientific discoveries in South America.
Like finds that push back the dates for human arrival a bit. Things like the Luzia skeleton in Brazil, or earlier dates suggested for sites in Patagonia, even though these are still way, way younger than Ameghino's claims.
Exactly, those kinds of finds. From the conspiracy perspective, these aren't seen as just normal scientific progress. They're viewed as grudging admissions, controlled leaks.
Leaks? How so?
The idea is that the establishment is being forced by undeniable data to slowly concede that people were in the Americas earlier than previously thought. But they manage the narrative. They release these slightly older dates, but never concede Ameghino's core point about millions of years or a South American origin for the whole human line. It's seen as proof the truth is slowly emerging despite the suppression.
So even evidence that contradicts Ameghino's timeline is spun as proof of a cover-up.
In a way, yes. It's seen as the system reluctantly giving ground, proving that the initial timeline they defended so hard was wrong, and therefore maybe the whole debunking of Ameghino was suspect.
Anything else?
One last subtle point is sometimes raised about how Tetraprothomo itself was described.
The actual characteristics.
Yeah. The descriptions often emphasize its supposed primitiveness. Some theorists speculate, what if it was actually more advanced? Or just different? A distinct type of hominin that didn't fit the neat linear story.
And the idea is that this was deliberately downplayed or misrepresented.
That's the speculation, that maybe its true nature was obscured to make it fit the desired narrative of a simple, early stage, easily dismissed, rather than something truly anomalous and challenging.
Okay, so that gives us a sense of the conspiracy arguments. Now, let's pivot back. What's the direct response from mainstream science to these claims of suppression?
Well, the mainstream scientific view fundamentally rejects the conspiracy narrative. They see the whole episode very differently.
How do they frame it?
They frame it as the scientific method working as intended. Ameghino made extraordinary claims, particularly about age.
Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
Precisely. And when his evidence, the fossils, the geology, was independently re-examined by experts like Hrdlicka and Willis, using the best methods available at the time, significant flaws were found. The dating was off. The key fossils were misidentified.
So it wasn't a conspiracy, it was peer review and correction.
That's the mainstream position. It's presented as a classic case of science correcting itself. A hypothesis was proposed, tested against the evidence by the community, and found wanting. The consensus shifted based on that evidence, not because of some secret plot. It's seen as a strength of science, not a weakness or a cover-up.
And they'd point to the mountain of evidence for out of Africa.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely critical point. The consensus on African origins isn't just about disproving Ameghino. It's built on over a century of positive evidence from Africa and around the world.
Fossils.
Countless fossils. Australopithecus, Homo habilis, Homo erectus, early Homo sapiens found across Africa.
Archaeology.
Extensive archaeological sites showing tool development and behavior patterns.
And genetics now, too.
And increasingly powerful genetic data mapping human migrations out of Africa. This huge body of converging evidence from different fields makes the out of Africa model incredibly robust. It's not something easily dismissed as just one biased group's agenda against a South American theory.
It's too big, too consistent across disciplines.
Exactly. Mainstream science also acknowledges that Ameghino did make genuine errors.
Honest mistakes.
Yes. Working with very fragmented fossils, interpreting complex geology before dating methods were refined. These were common challenges. They see his mistakes as understandable scientific pitfalls of the time, not as proof his critics were malicious.
So, respecting his effort, but recognizing the flaws in his conclusions.
Right. And crucially, they point out that even with much more research in South America over the last century,
Nobody's found evidence for Tetraprothomo or Pliocene hominids there?
no unequivocal evidence, no. The dates for the first peopling of the Americas are still debated, maybe pushed back to 20,000 or 30,000 years ago, some argue even earlier, but that's still late Pleistocene. It's nowhere near the millions of years Ameghino proposed. Later discoveries haven't validated his core deep time claim.
So the lack of confirming evidence is a big counterargument.
A very big one. And finally, there's the nature of science itself. Scientific consensus isn't dictated from the top down.
It builds up over time.
It builds from thousands of independent researchers, labs, universities around the world, testing, verifying, challenging. The idea that a small cabal could secretly control and manipulate this entire global, decentralized process for over 100 years.
Seems pretty unlikely.
Extremely unlikely, bordering on impossible from the mainstream perspective.
And the lack of any real whistleblowers. No smoking gun documents proving a conspiracy.
Correct. Despite over a century passing, no credible, verifiable evidence of a deliberate plot has emerged beyond the documented scientific critiques and debates themselves.
So the mainstream view is fascinating history, bold but flawed idea corrected by science. End of story.
Pretty much a case study in how science progresses.
Okay, but we still have this lingering question. If the science is settled for the mainstream, why does the conspiracy theory, the Tetraprothomo suppression, still resonate? Why do people find it appealing?
Well, the sources suggest it's less about the scientific details of Tetraprothomo itself and more about the powerful themes the suppression story taps into.
Like what? What themes?
Well, first, there's just the basic appeal of challenging the official narrative, right?
The idea that we're not being told the whole truth.
Exactly. The feeling that established history or science might be incomplete or even wrong is inherently intriguing to many people, questioning authority.
And it ties into that fascination with lost history, hidden knowledge.
Huge factor. The thought that there's a whole lost chapter of the human story out there, maybe involving different kinds of ancient people, forgotten abilities, ancient civilizations. It's incredibly captivating. It speaks to a desire for mystery and discovery.
The idea that there are secrets waiting to be uncovered.
Definitely. And for some people, this narrative resonates because they already have a certain level of distrust towards large institutions.
Including the scientific establishment.
Yes. If you're already skeptical about mainstream science or government or academia, then the idea that scientists would conspire to suppress inconvenient truths fits right into that existing worldview. It confirms a bias.
And you mentioned earlier maybe a lingering element of regional or national pride.
Could be a factor for some. Certainly, Ameghino's original work was a source of immense pride for Argentina and South America. The conspiracy theory could potentially tap into a similar feeling, a desire for the continent to hold a more central, more ancient place in human history than the current consensus allows.
Reclaiming that significance.
Perhaps. And finally, there's the enduring appeal of the maverick genius trope.
The lone individual fighting the system.
It's a classic, powerful story. The brilliant outsider with a revolutionary idea, battling against a rigid, closed-minded establishment that tries to crush them. It's relatable. Ameghino becomes a heroic figure in that narrative.
So the conspiracy theory's appeal seems really rooted in these broader psychological and cultural currents, more than in, say, new fossil evidence.
That's certainly what the analysis in these sources points towards. The story of a cover-up, With all its elements, the hidden history, the distrust, the lone hero just strikes a chord, regardless of the scientific arguments against Ameghino's original claims.
Okay, this has been a really fascinating exploration. We've gone from Florentino Ameghino's truly radical vision of human origins in ancient South America,
Based on finds like the Tetraprothomo bones, the tools, the terracosita,
to the rigorous scientific debunking led by figures like Elie Shordlichka, who concluded the evidence was flawed, misidentified, and misinterpreted.
a process mainstream science views as correction and progress.
But then we dove into this whole other layer, the conspiracy theory, that sees the debunking not as science, but as a deliberate suppression.
A cover-up orchestrated by powerful institutions to hide a potentially world-changing truth about our past, motivated by control, by Eurocentrism, maybe even by religious pressure.
So we have these two starkly contrasting narratives side by side. One sees a scientific error being corrected,
The other sees a profound truth being buried.
and the very idea that something so fundamental could be suppressed really taps into those deep-seated feelings about hidden knowledge and distrust of authority.
It absolutely does. It speaks volumes about our fascination with origins and secrets.
So as you, our listeners, think about the vast story of human origins, maybe keep this strange little chapter about Tetraprothomo in mind. Was it, as the scientific consensus holds, simply a case of a passionate scientist making understandable errors with limited data, errors later corrected through careful reevaluation?
Or does the tale of Ameghino, his radical ideas, and the way they were dismissed perhaps hint at something deeper? A different facet of human history, maybe, that certain powers preferred remain unknown?
The evidence, as presented today from our sources, points strongly one way, but the question, as framed by the existence of the suppression theory itself, lingers. Something to consider.